reality, physicality, the carbon, as in charcoal, based germ-sprouting existence in the 3D realm. 3D's a triskele, the number of a man, 666. DDD, three-pronged trident, the triune of creation, water, light, and its resulting earth, the Adamas, the Diamond, Adam Katmon. One could even wander through the play of words to its opposite, the digital, the numerical, or rather translation into abstracts to mean to dig it all, unearthing it all. Of course, plays on words are ingenuine. They are at best reflections from the beholder. Yet all things, as all is sound, may even as when a note is false to its chord, have a use. The alchemy of creation is now known. The attitudes toward are now known. One side tends to nature, accepting its cyclical process. In fire nature is renewed and purified. To this side nature holds beauty and purpose, and suffering is but the imbalance caused would one's undertakings be against it. The law of nature reveals itself. Fertility is as sexuality equates to physicality, a worship of the divine. The other side seeks to rectify the state of nature considered fallen, enveloping and entrapping shards of light, our luminary selves, with filth. This filth being carbon-based reality created by the demiurge, the creator, the sun. To this side, nature is jealous, debilitating, limiting, distracting, a violence. Fertility is elongating such, and is therefore opposed in every way, manner, shape, and form, whether it is with active murderous population reduction policies, such as wars or the intentional poisoning of peoples, birth control, removing gender, and so on. With as the end goal an end to physicality, it is simple to detect the hand behind every transhumanist virtual reality seeking development. The alchemy of creation was long known, but the prior side has worked to obscure its history and prominence. Yes, the entire earth was aware of the three-pronged creation, and of it, the emanator, the sun. The Most High, the light of the world, the anointed, surrounded by its creation, carbon-laden waters. He who walks on the waters, the multiplier of bread and fish, the haloed, the Son of Man, all symbology addressed it, and the prior side worked hard to either appropriate, vilify, or destroy such symbols, while carving its own over it in the form of speech confusion, writ, spelling. Originally, that which was scorned as yelled about was called Ariel, which means the god of the Ari. We know how eventually this solar entity was warped into the embodiment of worldly evil. When even small rays of remembrance shone through the cracks of their effort, they would set up entire peoples against it. From dealing with the originator of the Yeshua title as in blemish, Yaakov Atzadik, through the resisting of Slavic and northern tribes against the Judaist-founded Catholic Church, the rekindling of the nature culture among Germanic peoples up till today. In the end, with the end goal of a virtual reality in sight, it works harder than ever to incite their collateral against the rediscovery of nature's intentionally obscured foundation. They vilify, as they have vilified nature and its peoples endlessly through their Christian creation, those who have any attempt to self-sufficiency as given by nature, as satanic, pedophiles, and Nazis. All such allegations are made against the inflicted of Judaistraan industries, and would there be none, they would invent them through the screen, suggesting that such a thing as a worshipper of their mythological creature versions of solar vilifications actually exists in power. Everything except they themselves. Lastly, however, and most ridiculous as opposed to the satanic blemish, the moment one attempts to explain the prior Antichrist. If there could even be such a thing as being against the Christos, which refers to the anointed Son of Man, meaning Adam Katmon, the Son, other than being Jewish. One could start tearing out hairs at this point that of all people Christians dare to call others antichrists, while being themselves grifted into a culture that is anti-creation by definition. The Christian doctrine is a vile obscurement of alchemy, and all of its characters, whether saint or no, are metaphorical retellings of so-called pagan generational cosmogony. If Jewry got anything right, it is their claim that Christianity is idol worship in every manner, more stupendous even than the crafting of Greek statues to address. But we cannot forget that it was Jewry that made it so. Oh dear, it seems like we have to return to in the beginning, before we can ever come to understand how it was meant to end. In the beginning, Jerusalem was called Jebus, only later referred to as Salem. This word comes from Shalim, which is the god of the evening star Venus, the personification of dusk. This is ultimately an expression of the setting sun. In full, the location was referred to as Urshalim, or simply put, the city of the setting sun. The translation of all this has much to do with King David, in actuality referring to Thutmose III, who after taking Zion, renamed it the Kingdom of David, Thot as in Shamash, as David comes from duty, and Thot being the personification of knowledge from the sun, The voice or Ah of Thor. I will get back to this subject a few times eventually. Shalim's brother was the expression of the morning star, the rising sun named Shahar, the personification of dawn. We would know the combined entity as Shamash or Surya, thus, simply put, the sun including its aspects and attributes. It was Asherah who nursed the twins of dusk and dawn, and all such personifications became conflated many times over, to this day being misinterpreted as adversarious, mainly by the fool's garden known as Christianity. Oh yes, misinterpreted as even that tale of the morning star, a title given both to Adam, Lucifer, and Christos, rather than the prior conflated, actually truly all one and the same, Adam Kadmon, the light, and the anointed, as in oiled. Walk among the greatest fools, many a Christian and agnostic will tell you that the morning star refers to Venus. However, the most ancient notations on Shalim and Shahar explain that it is Shalim that is the evening star associated with Venus, and Shahar that is the morning star associated with the rising sun. Then there is the Hindu deity Shani, confusing many a scholar without an understanding of the aforementioned. This deity refers to Saturn, we know to be the primary state of the sun. Its symbol is the trident, as we should expect, but also the axe to refer to the right face of its story. Shani is a tale told about the fall of Saturn. Shani is depicted as black, is associated with time and age, usually seated on a crow, holds supreme authority and inflicts retribution. Rituals concerning Shani involve fasting and applying oil. I shouldn't need to explain their relation at this point. In other depictions, he or she rides an iron chariot drawn by 8 horses. The number is important here because 8 is the number of the sun and sun worshipper in all mystery religions. The chariot is another prime solar appendix, and being a horse lord is equally relevant, which ties the old sun Saturn to the newly risen sun. To the ancient Akkadian, Saturn was hardly a different beast named Sag-Ush. The Babylonian called it Kayavanu, which means the immovable, and is associated with death of cattle and cataclysm. Now, firstly, in our unveiled paradigm, one should by now realize that when one speaks of planets, it doesn't refer to the luminaries, but to regions on the Earth, planar locations. And a clear difference between the Akkadian and Aryan, also disproving some claims that it were the Akkadians, or other Mesopotamians, who founded the Aryan Age, lies in this association, as the early Vedic period of these Aryans was styled in very limited agriculture. They merely raised cattle. These people opposed city building and promoted food foresting and foraging, dealing with droughts. It was actually only after the invasion of Darius I in the 6th century before the recount that agriculture was developed in the Indus. Though we can only speculate about the pre-Diluvian age, in the mythology of Saturn's so-called father lies a proper reference to its syncretic cosmogony, Oranos, which means rainmaker. Being the father of Kronos would likely refer to the vapor canopy sometimes found in related discussions. Knowing the fall is associated with droughts, perhaps it would paint part the picture. We have in the Seams once more gone over the Hittite origin of Judaism, coming from an Akkadian-affiliated tribe, but discerning the Magi as merely infiltrated later. It is but a product of this old Hittite empire, from which a very specific Tanakh-obedient prototype of Judaism was conceived, known as the Karaim. Well, to add some nuance and proper specification, it is true that this address is particular to the 5th century generation of an ongoing Bene Tzaddik priesthood, but for linguistic convenience sake, not having to endlessly refer to many predecessing lineages much more obscure, I will use this address. Take note. And do understand that sometimes, therefore, there will be acts accounted to the Karaim that may not fit into the annuals, but are absolutely performed by the lineage from which the Karaim was the continuation. The Karaim are of the greater tribe of Levi. Their multitudes were expelled to the land of the Medes, and many stayed under the guard of Kyros. If you have watched In the Seams, you now understand how it were these very Karaim that used the Magi to impersonate and move into the northern nature culture tribes. The Karaim even today proudly admit that the Mashiach of the Yeshua blemish was titled Atzadik, and that it were the Rabbanites that conspired against him. They even likened him to Tzaddik. Now, who would you liken to Tzaddik if not Tzaddik's spiritual and hereditary successor? Yaakov, as in James. It were, after all, the Sadducee who opposed him. And for those who don't know, the Sadducee diminished from Sadducites, founded by a different Tzaddik, became typical priests, self-rewarding, arrogant interpreters of law. It is a widespread theory that the teacher of righteousness led his Essene movement as a split of faction because he considered himself the direct descendant of the Tzaddik. The Damascus document also shows that the Karaites in Egypt were in close contact with the Qumran community, although it is likely they opposed its aftermath because of the messianic nature. Tzaddik is in the name, Atzadik. The name means righteous to begin with, and its origin is either a pre-existing version of the deity Tzedek, also written as Tzedek by the Phoenicians, or Melchizedek. His full name would be the Righteous Priest. Philo stated that Tzedek was the son of Magos. Right, but was generally also equated with Jupiter, which we already know to be the personification of the sun. From Tzaddik came, at least supposedly, Thrace and the Sabiri. I must add that when held against what we know from in the seams, it may therefore have likely been that Tzaddik was not an actual individual, but a denominator for a priest class that was so-calledly tied to the sun culture. Perhaps the Therapeutai in earlier days? That could then translate to that the Therapeutai, as the righteous priest, had anointed the eventual leaders from the Thotmos line. It would certainly explain why the Tzaddikite priests were so opposed to idols, because idols confused and complicated the reality of the sun as the creator, which I too have dealt around 20 videos with, trying to translate them again and again, and still feel like I've only touched the surface. Not that I am saying here we should now all follow Jury, of course, knowing where it truly leads. The whether individual or denominator known as Tzaddik is connected to a group known as the Jebusites, by some considered co-opted by the Jews. To those who studied the Jebusites, it is no secret that their names often held the title Tzaddik, Melchi Tzaddik included. They are the ones that named what became Urshalim Jebus. The Jebusites were those who were trampled when David took over the Levant. Although scholars have brainstormed on their identity, sometimes claiming they were Hittite collateral, other times claiming they must have been Amorites. I would find it the most plausible that they were in fact a surviving tribe of Hatti, considering their connection with the old Mesopotamian language, but more importantly, Hurrian customs. Do note that the Hatti-Luvian region was spiritually connected with the Gaul and Northmen. They too called the creator Divos. Divos was to them also the god of the oath, but was replaced by the Hittites with Arina. At least the Hittites did acknowledge that Divos was the parent of Taur, as in Thora Gali was the parent of Thor. Divos is naturally the preceding state of the heavenly light, while Thor is the earthly form, although ultimately they are still the same entity in different phases. Whether Tzaddik originated of the Jebusites is only claimed by the eponymous Jebusite hypothesis, which I have to admit I know too little about. It may have arisen by the need to connect the idea of Tzaddik with a pre-existing Levantine population to grant claim, but leaves one with many questions. One thing that is clear is that the absolute origin of the Tzaddik is undeniably the aforementioned Melchi Tzaddik, who is the accounted historical benefactor of the Akkadian, personified as Avram. But there are many details to this Melchi Tzaddik that has one wonder whether this figure is himself not in reality a personification of the supernatural. Yaakov the Yeshua blemished is called a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. But Melchizedek himself is laden with symbolism. In the Talmud, his name is considered a nickname for Shem, written as Malki-Tzedek, translating to the righteous king. There are reasons to believe that Malki-Tzedek could refer to the sun god, generally also referred to as Tzaddik in Yebus. Then there is the fact that the king of Yebus was sometimes called Adonai Tzaddik, with Tzaddik eventually being replaced with Yahu. Are we here seeing the address of the sun being considered the king of Urshalim? And they accuse the West of creating idols. That would mean Melchizedek is yet another personified sun, and its eventual heritage indeed a sun-centered priesthood one would eventually know as Therapeutai, born from Ammonist and Atenist warpings, plagiarized out of the Thoraphitean roots. I'm not the first to come to this. The Nag Hammadi libraries also convey that Melchizedek is considered the same entity as Christos, which would be the sun. Another major link is that of Adramalik, which, as an entity proclaimed to carry the burden of man, symbolized with the mule as much as adorned with peacock feathers, translates to King of Tara, as Adra was originally written as Atara. Had the Jews, as in Akkadian Hittites, during their Davidic revival, indeed absorbed the Jebusite sun king into their Ammonists' paradigm, the puzzle pieces do fit and verify such a conclusion. Melchizedek and Abraham's story would then reflect the story of Esav and Yaakov, in the sense that Melchizedek may well be the setting sun called Urshalim personified, a nature culture losing its birthright because it slowly forgot the true creator and its sustenance, while Yaakov impersonated it and gained that birthright at least for a time in deception to its blinded generations. Generations that would bring forth many a priest and its mercenary prince. As is the common pattern of Judaism, its wrongdoings are laden upon its adversaries, pointing the finger and crying in pain as they strike. The Tanakh itself is the best example of idolatry through personifications, trying to concoct a false hereditary origin story with claims of royal descendancies, while in reality they plagiarized existing cultures from the start. Anyway, it is written that in 152 before the recount, Jonathan Maccabee made himself high priest. He thereby joined the role of king and high priest into one person. He was also seen as a usurper. The Palestine origin theory claims that the Essene movement formed during this time. It was a reaction to the corruption of the priesthood. They believed that their ancestral religion had become corrupted by non-Tzaddikites. They rallied behind a man they called Morea Tzaddik, the teacher of righteousness. He was the real high priest from the line of Tzaddik. Only he had the authority to interpret and teach the scriptures. The wicked priest opposed the teacher of righteousness. The wicked priest ruled illegitimately in Jerusalem. Ask a Karaim the name of the supposed Mashiach ben Yosef, and they too shall reply, Yeshua Atzadik. Give no respect and credence to this true identity of Yesu, however. As I've insisted before, this man was himself a rabbi and a Tanakh brainwashed individual, stuck to the Jewish Gnostic paradigm of self-flagellant undoing. Now, the Karaim were active as nomads in the Ukraine, Galicia and Poland, among other regions, as Karaite. It is stated by historians that these Jews, as in Hittites, came during the Byzantine migrations post-Mongol invasions. The word Karaim may either mean boss or faculty, or mercy of God, depending on the dissection of its roots, and in no way surprising to those who watched my upload in the beginning. In the Mongolian steppe refer to those who were the followers of the Khans. To the latter, it was also written that Genghis Khan was viewed quite negatively in the Rus culture, but very positively by the later Manchu, who, quote, positioned themselves as his heir. These Karaim are referred to when speaking about Khazarian elites, to the stupendous fraud of Arthur Kustler, trying to claim the Khazarians were fake Jews, while in reality converts had and have no power and were but collateral to them. The Karaim religion is called Karaite Judaism, or simply Karaism, which is specified as Judaism rejecting both Midrash and Talmud as divine in Puritan Tanakhian orthodoxy. Fake Jews? Yeah, sure. In short, they are pinpointed to have come from the Ananites, and that they were at first split into two factions, but both of Tzaddikite descent. The Karaite form in particular fractured into nigh infinite separate gatherings, one incomparable with the other. Some appointed leaders, some rejected leaders. They do oppose the Sanhedrin and Rabbinic Judaism, as in oral law, which can hardly be a nominator of Judaism to begin with, as it is considered exactly the critique. You know, the Talmud being considered fake Jewry by Christian numbskulls who mix everything up. Make up your mind. It is set in a goddamn stone that the origin of the Karaite language is Mesopotamian, and that it traveled exactly the path I have illustrated in my work of the movements of the Magyar tribes through the Turkic region up north into Crimea. There is no contest to this. Look it up if you must. Of course, we now know that they were not the Magi themselves, originating of the Saka tribes, but the Karaite parasite attached to them. Their cosmogony was once accurate anyway, in that God created an angel to be the builder and creator of the world, that it was this angel who revealed the law, and that it was this angel to which the anthropomorphic passages in the Bible refer, correlating with the Zoroastrian idea concerning Ahura Mazda emanating himself as the first light of genuity. Today, sadly, that idea has also been warped into the very anthropomorphic version, and even Messianism has been reinserted. It is also so that the Karaite root was very active both in Babylon and Persia, especially during the restructuring of the Magi under Darius the Great. In fact, this is exactly when the Avesta was being reformed, and added to with the very Judaist-flavored book against the Devas, the Vindidat, which is mainly concerned with social laws. It is stated that the Vindidat was composed by Magi, but the when is more important than the if. Knowing now after the study of In the Seams that the Magi were indeed recreated under new management prior to the writings of this Vindidat, it cannot be accounted to the earlier Zoroastrian works, besides that the Magi are not the same as the Zoroastrians in the first place, which we have gone over many times with plenty of proof. It can only be a synthetic insert warping the Avesta, and to add to the pattern, it wasn't meant for the student, but for the higher priests. The dating is accurate to the same dating of the influence of Darius the Great, when Tzaddikites were flooding the religious marketplace. Thankfully, most modern Zoroastrians have a good understanding of the alien nature of the Vindidat, and either entirely reject it or take from it only that which isn't against the spirit of the Gathas. We, however, are greatly aided by the existence of such a work, because it proves an infiltration, and we know where it came from. Perhaps the Karaite facet also explains why Israel invests so much into Qatar. And remind one, I cannot overstate this, of the Tartaria hoax, trying to implant the idea that we all originate of a Tartarian old world with superior technology, paving the way for a rebuilding of this joint Hittite-Ukraini empire, which held that exact territory, with transhumanist stepping stones toward virtual aspirations. Of course, with all we have uncovered in the Seams, I will add that we did have a Brotherhood of Erin, spanning from what we today call Europe all the way into the land of the Rus. All the Shaka tribes were, though interwarring, cut from the same wood, especially when it comes to the shared cosmogony and its cultural expressions. And the cathedrals of pagan lands, later appropriated and plastered over by Christian infiltrators, were indeed built with, if you will, technology no longer used today, that of sound and water, sunlight and water, light and darkness employed in unison. This is not a new story we are told about Tartaria herding us into a battery. This is certainly not history, once again being overlaid with Christian fairy tales, ignoring our ancestors' greatness and grace, to replace it with Jewish fantasies and plagiaries. From academic papers, In Russia there appeared a Karaite national movement, which also attempted to achieve an autonomous political status for Russian Karaites. Similar attempts have been made by Crimean Karaites. The majority of the latter also developed the ideas of Saraya to unprecedented extremes, severing all links to Judaism and tracing their ethnic origins to Mongol Turkic roots, and their religion to Turkic pagan practices, and the cult of the Turkic deity Chungri. Oh yes, do not forget that they were also called Major, and that their land was called Major Orsak. Now, there is the consensus that the language of these peoples was tied with the Mesopotamian, but did you know that in Akkadian the word pronounced as Orsak doesn't mean country but warrior, and that the etymological path connects directly with this, as Orsag comes from Urasag. Originally the Magyar were called the Deciders, Dentamajor, who took over the position of leadership from the Sub-Aryans. In Mesopotamian, Dentamajor is translated as lawmakers. It proves the connection between the Magyar and the Mesopotamian region as much as the Karaites themselves, and at the same time disconnects them from the Aryan host of the region. The word Turk comes from Sumerian Churuk, while connecting to Uruk, and is considered to mean set apart. It does indicate that there was indeed an overtake of the original Magyar population by Neo-Hittite tribes, clearly infused with a priest class of Aramaean nature. Of course, the mainstream believes the opposite, in that the Magyar created such an address into the Turkic language. Well, we already know that Tur as much as Taurus and Thor connect to Tyr, and these respective addresses were already in the area through the Hatti, which themselves were Thorophytean cultured peoples. As was another people I have been reluctant to speak of. In Sumerian we would have the word Tur to mean broken, like how the sun broke off from its throne. So how come the Magyar language is so similar to Sumerian? Now, before we start pointing our fingers at Sumer with a frown, there is a detail to this region that disconnects it from early Akkad and reconnects it with the Aryans, explaining why the original Magyar were in no way an opposing force to the Western peoples. The Magyar were themselves called Sub-Aryans, as much as the Hurrites. Even the Asharians were Westerners, later the center of the Kassites, who were northern riders. Asurs meaning then being warped into Azza-ur, which translates to horse lords. These Kassites themselves were controlled by a priest class, after which they were scattered by a, quote, Semitic revolution, referring to the Chaldeans, and fled right into the arms of a religious center, preordained most likely, as is how Christianity has functioned in our era. Ultimately, this Kassite exodus became the founding of Urartu, after Assur had been taken over by Semitic forces. It started to levy high taxes on the entire Mesopotamian region they conquered. This was of course not exclusive to Assur, but it explains rising tensions in the area, contrived by that certain same jolly fucking group, whether it was Assur, Babylon, or the Saka. Everywhere there was this worm laying its eggs and whispering in the ears of kings and princes. This priest class I had mistaken to be the original Moji, because of the appropriation of its apparel as much as the steering of its host northbound, connecting with the folklore of nature cultures. I saw the shape but not the sound, the city but not its network, the fruits but not the parasite hidden within. When it comes to the northbound, there are clear relations between the Hittites and quite possibly related Lulubi peoples with the Juqin that became the segmented Manchu we know to be connected with the Yudenhut. These Juqin were also called Naishin, and although they are sometimes conflated to all have been wild people, they lived in separate groups having different cultures, as we know Juri to include, of which only one was considered a wild and barbarian group. Another important detail is that the Juqin were differentiated as Juxun from the Manchu, also called Manju. There is another link with Mesopotamia, in that the Juqin, being of the southern tribes, are called reindeer people, also referred to as Uruk, which sounds a lot like Uruk. This could have been coincidental, if not for the fact that the northern tribes are referred to as Varka. Uruk in Mesopotamia is also called Varka. Universally, such peoples grafted in with the Manchu were the Ukanju. The Manchu Ukanju are defined as the Varka Ukanju, or Varka Juqin. And although some scholars used to think that they were the slaves of the Chinese, it eventually turned out that they were in truth very much including the elite aristocrats and military commanders of Ming, who fled from the Mongols, retaining such status. It is so explained that the address Ukanju henceforth referred to peoples who fled from their own country to another place, and many were utilized as spies. The description given of the Juqin is that they shaved their foreheads and wore their hair in a braid, much like both the Lulubi and the Hittites. Of these do know that it were the Lulubi that rebelled against the Gutians when they took Akkad. Not a small detail. Not to say that the Lulubi are the Hittites, but that there is a connection between the peoples that the Hittites appeared amongst and took over, as much as the later Karaites infiltrated. My theory is that these Lulubi, usually considered a branch of the Hurrian, as much as the Hittite and later Nicene Juqin are all of the same wood, an ancient split branch of the same foundation of Air. For picture yourself this: the symbology of the Jew tree is rebirth, and we all know what Jewry works to accomplish: the rebirth of Saturn's age, meaning that of the leafless, branchless tree. One could therefore speculate, as I do, that jury is as proven by their knowledge and intentional inversion of nature's alchemy. A rogue druidry removed, sprouted forth from the Hittite that came of these exiles, installing itself as an unnatural hierarchy over the Shaka that came from that very same druidic root. Or am I taking it too far? If there ever was a starting point, we already know it to be Doggerland's region. And now we're getting somewhere. Hold your pointy hats, because this statement may come as quite a blow to the unprepared. Sumer was itself founded by the so-called West, as much as the West founded the Aryan Age of the Indus and the first pharaohs of Egypt. Before I lay this out, I have to add that there is, comparable to the distraction of Arthur Kustler's 13th tribe fake Jew insert, the translucent theory that the Amorites were the Hyksos, though it is certainly possible that a remnant situated in Amuru became grafted into the late Hyksos dynasties. The lack of research is showing when one bases such an erroneous theory on the detail of the Amu being addressed as Hekakasut, because there was no such thing as the Hyksos, considering a Hyksos was simply a term for foreign king, and applied as much to the Numians and other migrants to the Egyptian dynasties. That a single tablet exists where therefore an Amu individual is referred to as a Hyksos does not prove that the specific Canaanite dynasties of Hyksos were Amorites. It is also more likely that the notation of Amu refers to the Aramu and not the Amorites. Aramu naturally referring to the Arameans, which is an entirely different people originating of the 12th century before the recount and conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th before the recount. The confusion is understandable, but the claim unforgivable. It were namely the Alamu that are named as those that displaced, absorbed and destroyed the Amorites in the 13th century before the recount, and then were themselves squashed by the Middle Assyrian Empire with only their Levantine pockets remaining. It is said they were defeated, attacking Israel in the 11th century before the recount, but still continually were strong enough to fight against the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th up till the 6th, and then claimed subjugated, which still doesn't mean destroyed, but rather in exile. And to where? Well, mainly into Babylon. This may have you think that if the Arameans were the exiled in Babylon, how does it link the Hyksos to the temple cults? It is because the Arameans are of the mixed multitudes and the Hyksos are naturally the Hittite-Akkadian bloodline that technically is actually native to the Potamian region. The main source of confusion is the address of language, Semitic. Both Arameans and Amorites communicated in Semitic languages, although, for one, Aramaic is incomparable to Hebrew, albeit also considered a barbar language, and the Amorites spoke in Akkadian. The reality is that most Semitic languages are not native to the Levantine region to begin with, even those that originate from ancient Sumer. The language native to the Levantine region simply is Akkadian, and without Akkadian there would have been no Aramaic, because that is originally an Assyrian adaptation of Akkadian. The Arameans being exiled ties them to the Chaldeans, who appeared right after the Arameans were grafted in by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This would also correlate with the Chaldean address of northern tribes. It may sting to those hoping that the matter of what exactly Jewry is as simple as identifying by outward appearance, but it is not so. Jewry is, apart from a few physical traits, outwardly nigh impossible to pinpoint. One must look at the actions, and more importantly, the behavior that leads to those actions, the infiltration, the sabotage, and the appropriation of other cultures. This also means that you cannot point at a specific people and state that they are the Jew from start to finish. Every culture in the region was infiltrated and steered into actions that clearly did not profit themselves. The origin of these cultures were more often than not Western, being used as mercenaries without their own knowledge, as the Jew calls it, selling their birthright for some food. The same goes for the Arameans as much as for the Amorites. It is quite similar to the Shaka tribes interwarring, the Kaganate tribes interwarring. These people were thrown into each other by hidden priests, and so were the aforementioned. Neither were the Jews we have been looking for. They were simply individual tribes of nomad peoples, drifting away from their Irish foundations. An example of the Aramean nature-culture connections is their deity Yarubal, which, like the word Yar, referring to the Slavic word for spring Yaru, is also the god of spring. This deity was already worshipped by the Amorites before them, in the form of Bai-Chir. There's that Chir connection. One could wonder whether the Jewish Gnostic address of the Creator being Yaldabaoth is a bastardization of Yaribol, although during the polytheistic era it was part of a solar pantheon next to entities such as Agribal and Baal Shamin. Now, let's do a quiz question. In which Potamian locations did they celebrate New Year during the March equinox? No googling, I'll just tell you. Persia, the Indus Valley, and Babylon. The first founded by Sarmatians, the second founded by the Irish, the third founded by the Amorites. Now, guess what the name was for Uruk in Aramaic? Yeah, Iraq. What does that sound like? Where the name Iraq comes from and Iran. The English tongue may obscure it, but in the Germanic tongue we call so-called Ireland, Ierland, with the E as in an E and not the sound of I. Iran, as you can hear, is pronounced the same as is Iraq. Phonetics matter. This is how you get Aryan from Ayer. I really hate to break it to all those who thought Sumer was some kind of absolute foundation. Well, at best it was a new start. A frontier by an older Irish civilization, like America. Before Uruk, there existed the so-called Ubaid period, itself about 5,000 years old, making it still 1,000 years younger than the hill of Tara in the Ayer, to put things into the right perspective. Even the Sumerian flood myth states that the oldest city in the entire world was Eridu. Does that sound like a certain place? Eridu, perhaps the original name of the Ayer? The timeline, as much as acts of the Hittite Empire in the region, prove that, for one, the Amorite domination was ended by the Hittite war machine, and secondly, the appearance of Hyksos in Egypt coincided exactly with the appearance of Hittites moving into Canaan, holding at their peak the entire northern Levant within their borders, while Apopis, as in Epaphus, brought Egypt's riches straight to their border gates. This alone should suffice in sinking such selective claims. Why is this important? Because the Amorites are connected to the aforementioned Doggerland Irish foundings of Sumer, and blaming them for Jewry is equal once more to the scapegoat ritual of lading the Jewish atrocities onto its opponent. The Amorites were known as Martu and once also held the region of Ashur. They were considered enemies by Akkad, against which walls were erected. Their ways were of the wild, shunning agriculture and using herds for its milk and hunted for their meat, which the city peoples of Akkad perceived as primitive. They foraged and were nomads, generally vilified and equated with monkeys and godless peoples, based on that they did not bend the knee. Such vilifications are combined with trollery such as to call them mountain dwellers. But in reality these people were not mountain dwellers, but of the highlands, described as of great stature and strength. They were perceived as noble peoples, not as monstrous as Akkad depicted them. It is true that the Amorites were not isolated to the region and absolutely roamed the Levant as well prior to the Hyksos appearances. This does not make them Jews. Neither does it make them Jews to have had some presence in Egypt, as will soon be understood in connection to the founding of Egypt by the people of the Ayer. Yes, they were depicted with hooked noses, just like the Hittites, mind you, but also with fair hair and blue eyes, which the Hittites had not, nor do the actual Jews today, apart from some inbreeding with sea peoples. It is also important to note that the Amorites are named as enemies of the Jewish faith in the Tanakh, and their last king called Og, slain by Moses. Og is depicted as a barbarous giant, but he ruled an immense capital with walled-off towns called Ashtaroth, or Tel Ashtara. There is that Tara connection again, yes. In other legends, he is not perceived as among men, but more as a gigantic giant holding up a mountain in the middle of the ocean, which he threatened to drop onto Israel. This somewhat correlates with the stories of Antaeus we know to be the allegory to the cutting of the world tree. There too, it does make sense why his city would be called Ashtaroth, in reference to Taru as in Tara, pointing to the same entity. As you heard, Ashtaroth, as does Ashir, comes from two words being Ash and Tara, meaning blood of Tara, Assyria containing the word Ayer. It is even accepted as much as verified that the Jebusites were closely related, and we know what happened to them. The Amorites were a people defeated by the Jewish campaign, not of it. Of these, a mere remnant survived and made covenant with the Israelites. This defeat of the Amorites is considered one of the major victories for Israel and the God of the Jews. To perceive the Amorites as the source of Hyksos Jewry is an exposition of intellectual poverty. The Amorite language was northwestern, much set apart from the Akkadian eastern style. The Ugarit dialect is closely connected, and many scholars think this is where the Amorites came from in the first place, the northeastern Shaka regions. Their supreme god is Dagan, misinterpreted as a fish man by a faulty etymological address by what else? Medieval Christians. This chief god is also called Amuru, like Amaru of Amaruka, which refers to the feathered serpent and is in reality a sun god. Dagan comes from Dagda, which simply means good god. It is a combination of the name Dagda with An, which is of course the name of Danu, its nurturing mother. He was the god of prosperity, royalty, and the father of all other gods. It is important to add that he was also the god of the Philistines, which, as I have handled in previous videos, were Aegean peoples, and also called the god of the great mountain, which was a title also given to Enlil, which we know is the personification of solar cataclysm, so it's not that strange and certainly does not mean anything but a relation to the source being the sun. Some pseudo-researchers after all claim that any relation to Enlil has to mean that something is Jewish. Such people are illiterate to the meaning behind such deities being attributes. It is the same mistake most make when reading the universal El, simply meaning God, coming from the ancient Irish Elaine, and perceiving it as the name of the Jewish appeasement deity that is itself a ceremonial position against it. Enlil itself is often named apart and therefore separate from Dagan as well. Another title of Dagan was Lord of Offspring. His king-making should be read as equal to the mythology of the Huma, which made kings through knowledge, not through a priesthood coronating them. Lastly, two more titles that connects him to the sun is that he was called the Lord of Tutul and of Chirka. He was not viewed as originally native to the region, as Mesopotamia viewed Dagan as of the western lands. The fish appendix is entirely a medieval misreading, as Dagan is pronounced Dagon by the Canaanites with a long pronounced O to copy the long pronounced A. The apparel is also misattributed, as the fishman generally given as the representation of Dagan is simply an Apkallu, which are the 7 sages, from which the plagiary of Enoch also took its archangels. Then there is the fact that the Apkallu covered with the pelt of a fish appeared not until exactly the Kassite period. It is believed that Dagan was first introduced to Mesopotamia from Mari, and was worshipped there overtly by the Amorites. The Amorites also were alleged to worship Sion, which we know is the moon god and father of Shamash. A later Amorite version of this same sun would be Adad or Hadad, perhaps because of competing address, sometimes called a brother of Shamash, but clearly the same entity, being titled the Thunderer, Lord of Abundance, He who rides the storm, and Lion of Heaven, Great Radiant Bull, as much as a son of Anu. Its appearance is an amalgamation of the Dagda and Thor archetypes, and considered the Ashur-Babylonian form of Jupiter by Rome, holding the Dagda's dual-natured club of killing and resurrection. Urninurta described Adad as both life-threatening and life-giving. During the Kassite era, the peaceful character of this personification changed into a fear-striking, jealous, war-hungry entity we know today from the Bible, which is the earliest clue to the change in attitude toward the Creator. But do note this Kassite era started in the 16th century before the recount, right after the Amorites had been conquered by the Hittites. No coincidences there. They renamed Babylon to Cardunia, also called Karadunis. The Amarna letters show correspondence between the Hittite and Kassite regions and contain information about intermarriages, especially between the Kassites and Elamites. It were the Kassites that built the temple to Enlil there. When the Kassites came into conflict with Assyria, Elam intervened, and in the 12th century before the recount put a stop to the troublemaking of the Kassite era. Exactly during the same time the name Hittite ceases to come up in the records of history. No coincidences there either. With all of this, we have a clear piece of proof that there was a Hittite cause to how the Creator was approached, correlating with the contrast between the nature culture and Judaism. The Amarna letters also show proof that one of the early Kassite kings held a diplomatic relation with Akhenaten, referenced in a complaint to Tutankhamun concerning the support request of Canaanites. It is relevant to mention that Akhenaten, prior to Tutankhamun, had forbidden worship of the old gods as he introduced Atenism, Tutankhamun being the one who reversed this and actually attacked the Hittites. The fact that the Canaanites are specified as rebelling in the Amarna letter and begging for support against Akhenaten, and that the Habiru invaders are favored over the leader of Jebus, is another piece of proof of the Hittite Hebrew connection. Besides that, even the Bible itself admits that King David's army's highest officers were Hittites. Now, this does not mean that the Kassites are the origin of the Jews. That still is the Hittites. But the earliest appearance of Kassites is in the 18th century. Before the recount, the earliest appearance of Hittites is also in the 18th century before the recount. My theory would be that these Kassites were simply a mercenary branch of the Hittites. Also because the earlier Kassites had so-called Indo-European names, and their language is close to Ugarit, we know to be of the Shaka as well. The Kassites would here be an occupational force, like how Jewry uses America as its occupational force. We know how the priest class grafted their strongmen from the youth of nature culture populations all across the world. After Thutmose III took Megiddo, the three powers that sent him gifts and praise were the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Hittites. Only the Mitanni refused to do so. Now, there is a detail not to be left out when it comes to the background of the Atenist and the Ammonist that came before it, rooted in the Hyksos overtake of a peculiar deity of Thebes, Mont. Mont at Thebes was a hawk-headed god, replaced by Ammon. Mont has many similarities with Horus, and its capital was called Heru Montis, to which we know Heru to be another name for Horus. It is safe to assume, therefore, that Mont was another regional form of Horus. The holy bull Bacchus was also associated with him. When the Hyksos eventually were driven out of Egypt, these victors came from Thebes and dedicated their success to Ammon, comparable with how Christians today dedicate their victories over Jewish opponents to the divine providence of a Jewish entity. You may be pleased to know that Ammon was already a rewriting of Khnum, which is a personification of the alchemical process of the sun molding man like clay from the waters. The orientation toward Khnum isn't that strange, considering Thebes was originally called Vozet, which is the goddess that protects childbirth. Atonism must have sprouted from the hierarchical nature of Ammon, it being a sort of prototype to the Christian overwriting of the existing pagan solar deity, with Jewish priest class requirements. So, after Amos drove out the Hyksos, Ammon, wearing the mask of Khnum, was reunited with Ra and became Amun-Re. Amos may have been a hero when it came to defeating the Hyksos. He was apparently blind to what they had injected into Egypt's impression of the deity, and he left it alone until the insanity of Akhenaten ensued from its impure seed. Despite Atonism being the pinnacle of the hierarchical form, at least the hymn to Aten is revealing to the foundation of the deity, as there could not be a clearer description to listen to with the sun in mind. When thou crossest the sky, All faces behold thee, but when thou departest, thou art hidden from their faces. When thou settest in the western mountain, then they sleep in the manner of death. The fashioner of that which the soil produces, a mother of profit to gods and men, a patient craftsman, greatly wearying himself as their maker, valiant herdsman, driving his cattle, their refuge and the making of their living, the sole Lord, who reaches the end of the lands every day, as one who sees them that tread thereon. Every land chatters at his rising every day, in order to praise him. They don't teach that in schools. After the self-serving Atonism was thankfully removed from the region, Amun-Re was naively reinstalled and became the most perfect example of the absolute origin of Christianity, described as the salvation of the poor. From this entity came the Therapeutai, somewhat inspired by the Katnobata and Tarapitean culture before it, infected with the Amen aspects, muddying the waters and poisoning the well, festering on. The Amen priesthood was more powerful than the Pharaoh itself, and we know what came out of their line in terms of the mixed multitude. Oh yes, the Levites. Although the name Amen was obscured in Egypt eventually, the power of it continued among the Nubians as Amani, who could even compel kings to commit suicide by command of the religious leaders. It may be confusing to the Bible scholar that Amen is chastised as something to be punished in Jeremiah, but herein lies the secret of allegations against the Iesu figure, which is amalgamate with its solar aspects, as much as the Egyptian origins of Christianity. Oh, and you know, another hidden aspect is the depiction of horns on many biblical and some historical figures being called Amen's horns. So, what has one learned from this so far? That a proper address of the deity when the sun is concerned was appropriated, utilized to the whim of a parasitical caste, no, entirely turned against all creation, all it intended. Very well. With all that said, let us return to the address of the Moji for a bit. In Sumerian, the word Sagush, being the name of Saturn, translates to head of man, and connects with the eventual Mojo language we know was also later infused with Aramaic. Well, do you remember the translation of the Dentamojor? The deciders or lawmakers? These were not always controlled. You see, the oldest entry of a Majan name is the Sumerian region known as Majan, existing since the 23rd until the 5th century before the recount, giving its location to be Tilmun. As we would expect, it was opposed by Akkad. It was the maritime hub of the age, carrying in large vessels trade between Sumer and the Indus. We know was during that time populated by the Irish, starting the Aryan Age in the 15th century before the recount. Considering Mesopotamia being closer to the Indus ports, is it too strange to suggest Sumer was populated by these Aryu people first, before they sailed on to the Indus? I had never figured that one out had I not broken through my misunderstanding of the Magi origins, now knowing they were a brethren people of the nature culture. Can I rest my case? Not yet. We have always perceived the Mesopotamian subject as a region entirely isolated from the West, either a tree of its own roots or at best a distant cousin of another, either African or, depending on who you ask, Urkic foundation. It is not so. Mesopotamia's cultures have every tell to be a product of the Arya, directly fathered by the same people who fathered Egypt and the Indus. One of these tells was the name Ashtara, both for the city of Og and as the root of Ashur. We now know that the Aryan idea of the deity to be a kindred elemental providing abundance in its fruitful creation was inverted during the Kassite rule of Babylon, and we find the same accounted to Akkad, where Ashtara was renamed to Ashtar an-Nunitum, which translates to war-like Ashtara, exactly identical to Babylon's personality change. It is no surprise that it's also where the Kassites who rebuilt the Ashur Ashtar an-Nunitum temple after they there found it destroyed. In the end, the nature culture, that of the Irish, Gaelic, Gaul and northern peoples, including the Geta Shaka branches, that Judaism plagiarized thrice over through their Babylonian speech confusion, was right. This is my claim to prove. With this work, I would hope I am making a good case to illustrate exactly the issue of the ancient war between the peoples who tend to nature and those who oppose it. Now, the reality is that there is no such thing as a genuine Jewish claim to the Levant. Jewry is rooted in the loyalty to the Davidic annexation of that land and the people that lived there before. The Hatti, the earliest to it, are all but blotted out from the history books. Therefore, the so-called rights of ownership are equal to every other tribe that has ever lived on its fertile crescent. Whether it is the Aegean Philistines or the Turkic, as in Hittite root of Jewry, but of all peoples that think they have this claim, it is certainly not the religious Jew. It is not the Judaist basing their entire identity and culture on the misinterpretation of the Creator to be a fear-imposing entity to please or appease, to sacrifice to create scapegoats for. When it comes to David, it is so that he hired a certain people written down usually as Apiru or Habiru. These peoples were mercenaries that are even by the mainstream attested to have also lived in Mesopotamia. I do believe that this is the detail that lies at the basis of the theory that the eventual Israelites were Amorites, we know to be another Iron Branch that populated Mesopotamia, while those Amorites were long gone during. Instead, these Habiru are tied to the Shaka that just as much included Kassites, at least to their behavior and composure. If Amorite remnants were part of the Habiru, it wouldn't have been many, nor with any power whatsoever. It must be said that today we would call the Habiru Hebrew. These Habiru built entire cities for the Thutmose bloodline. Amorites would have fought to the death against these pharaoh instead. It also doesn't fit the Amorite religion that the Habiru worshipped Yah, representing cataclysm and appeasement. If they had been Amorites, they would have worshipped Dagan as in Hadad, representing providence. And we know even from biblical accounts that culture simultaneously was heavily repressed by the Yah-worshipping Hebrews, destroying any statue of it they could find. The root of Yah, being the Semitic Yav, is written down as a rival of the Baal Hadad cult. Anyone still claiming the Amorites were either Hyksos or Hebrews ignore all such details to defend their book sales. Oh, the Hebrews were never native to the Mesopotamian region either. Only the Hatti somewhat were, and even they are connected to the Ari-Solar nature culture, while their scribes were Assyrian. Then there are still those that claim Judaism and Zionism are different things. They are not. We already know the Talmud rejecting Karaites call themselves mourners of Zion, but Judaism, as much as the Second Temple Karaite movement, are based entirely on the annexation of Mount Zion by David. It therefore is loyalty to the Davidic conquering of the Jebusites, loyal exactly to the inversion of address concerning the Creator. Can we finally cast off the illusions now? One should not want to be a Jew, for it is the most destructive religion that has ever plagued this earth, seconded only by its children. It should alarm all mankind that exactly this mystery religion is being rekindled among civilizations today in many shapes and forms, whether it is the aforementioned virtual reality acceptance, gradualized to reach Ein Sof as in Ein Sof, through AI-ran entertainment as is the course of transhumanism, made possible by overstimulating the population to estrange it from reality, while amplifying reality's frustrations, to condition mankind to an incremental sense of apathy, if not nihilism, or the less obvious opposition of self-proclaimed enlightened teachers, gaining following with snippets and derailing the genuine unveiling with false paradigm shifts, as much as those who, while thinking they are uncovering the reality of the matter, are funneled right into the Gnostic doctrine of perceiving reality as a prison leeching off so-called loosh, the Creator as a tyrant, and the only solution, self-undoing as much as rejecting all creation. And that is exactly why they are gaining popularity on the very sites fashioned to tip the scales to the celebration of the internet as the weapon that won the war against the deep state, when doing away with all the theater, in reality referring to, yes, that abyssal creation of nature. Can you now finally read the symbols with me? The vilification employed through the Judaization of the pagan regions into Christianity. Do you see the sun and its creation warped into the Jewish Gnostic devil, a jealous and trapping demiurge in these illustrations as I have shown them to be? Judaism cares nothing about the destruction of either its collateral or its stages, and remember that such stages include entire countries. Oh yes, Israel means nothing to the Judaist, as it perceives all creation to be a threat to their idea of gnosis. No one that opposes Judaism opposes it truly until it opposes its doctrine of the earthly being a confinement and lesser reality. Only the end goal of destroying nature and building a non-physical kingdom of light is of value to the Judaist. In fact, therefore, nothing in the physical realm is anything but collateral to this endeavor. Understand that, and you will no longer be distracted by the theater of wars, despite its very real victims. The outcomes of these wars are not the stakes. The entire earth could burn, and it would be nothing a Judaist would fight against, but will fight to cause. So it is to the distraction of those who overtly argue against Judaism, among which many Christians but also self-proclaimed Gnostics, while they enforce its very aspirations, rejecting nature. Judaism fears not the casualty of its collateral. It only fears losing a following to the end goal, and as long as casualty creates following, then casualty is even preferred over mercy. Following can be as simple as collateral to Judaism, binding together, seeking refuge in their faith, and this has been the predetermined outcome in many a Judaist conflict. Making living conditions worse is the greatest feat of Judaism, for it invokes dread, fear, and rejection of reality to all parties involved. The greatest threat against Judaism is thusly not violence. It enjoys every violence inflicted upon its collateral, and makes the most of it. No, the greatest threat against Judaism is Judaism being deprogrammed among its collateral, to the point of it being as insignificant as a group of geriatric hippies. Its collateral include Islamists and Christians, which each give a slightly different type of credence to it. It is these two children of Judaism that are its butchers, however, that have been created mainly to invade and demolish the nature culture that Judaism stole from, sometimes even by utilizing enslaved pagan peoples as cannon fodder, like how Islam employed the Mamelukes. The first target of Islam was the same as that of Christianity, all pagan symbols. Islam and Christianity are the more dangerous, as the main body of Judaism has merely scribes and cowardly degenerates in the literal sense, inbred and physically retarded peoples. One would almost understand the hatred against physicality from such a tormenting state. It is difficult to deprogram a Christian, as the Christian fears above all things to break faith, which would mean they believe they will lose the only provider they have as the ultra-dependent people they are, given up its faith in the personified fantasy as a Christian experience banishment from its Christian community. It is stated that a Christian that loses his or her faith is weak, astray, and following the devil, and generally going to hell. It is more difficult to deprogram a Muslim because the Muslim fears above all things the communist culture it lives under, seeking all, judging all under threat of capital punishment, where a Christian is merely ostracized from their former kinsmen. The Muslim is pursued mercilessly. One could say that Islam is the perfected form of Catholicism, and therefore the perfected form of Judaism, utter surveilled Marxism. No, Christianity and Islam are the strong men, those willing to kill the children of nature, simply because to the Christian and Islamist these are heretical, non-Jewish, and therefore Christianity and Islam must be wiped off the face of the earth. We should give Judaism such it wants, but not all it wants. We should give Judaism the war between Christianity and Islam, so that these moronic, degraded mercenaries are removed as its spiritual guardians. But we should allow Judaism no time and chance to bring in their pre-made solution, their roadmap, but deprogram it entirely with the revelation of their invert alchemy I have done my best to explain to you. Their employ of alchemy must come to an end, and the mere understanding of it must bring the peoples that have fallen for the Judaist lies back to nature. What is Christianity other than the journey to join Judaism in the world to come, strapped into the ride of its self-written prophecies to the initiated? What is Islam other than a refined war machine to aid the same indoctrination, albeit from the aspect of the moon, the god of Ishtar's water, Ishmael, Shin of Potamia, claimed to be the father of Shamash, or as we know it, the memento mori of the age of Saturn. The Judaist-founded Catholic Church inspired this. If you remember how I explained that a Catholic family member of Muhammad told him that his visions came from Gabriel, this man, known in the history books as Varaka, was also said to have been a Nazarene prior, and there are plenty of theories about whether he actually wrote the Quran, considering the moment he died, Muhammad was accounted to have not received any more visions for a long time. From the Quran, Aisha said she took him to Waraka bin Nawfal, who was a Christian convert and used to read the Gospel in Arabic. Waraka asked, "What do you see?" When he told him, Waraka said, That is the same angel whom Allah sent to the prophet Moses. Should I live till you receive the divine message, I will support you strongly. Islam, born at an age where Nazarene favored Catholic Christianity was booming in the area, did so at its calling. So let them, as even the Freemasons anticipated in their Judaist employ, to which one could take the words of Albert Pike, let them destroy atheism and Christianity, though be obliterated themselves in return. And also to his word, yes, the pure light of what one calls Lucifer, as in simply light, and rather that of the sun, must be received, but not through Freemasonry nor its commanding officer Judaism. It must be received through the law of nature alone, in absolute freedom from these hierarchies of priests and princes, with no intermediaries nor interpreter of the cloth, no surveillance, policing, economical nor racial motivations. Physicality should be held in higher regard than even morals, decency, custom, and tradition. And we all know how much nature's image has been intentionally warped once more, to vilify it altogether with the LGBT debauchery, making a mockery of genuine love, of all things generative and beautiful. So they call it animalistic, again vilifying nature as one should expect from spellings. You know that word means breathing, as in having spirit, right? The satire. The satire. Very well. Let's get to the conclusion by undoing the vilification of nature one last time. Let us take nature by the horns and take a good look at it. The satyr is, after all, at least in my humble opinion, the most readable symbol to represent it. To the Greek, the satyr was called the Silenos, a perfect depiction of fertility resembling the level of Priapos. Of course, there is the link to satur, as in to be saturated, full of food, which nature is. And the cheer part is neither coincidental. Nature as the learning companion of the thrice-made Dionysius, like the aforementioned Priapos, a comical and exaggerated depiction of the sexual aspect of nature, and in particular, creation. To the Greek, this entity was the inspiration of the tragic to their Gnostic mysteries. As a learning companion, the allegory of this figure is immediately unveiled, as nature, the cyclical process of the age of man, is indeed a learning, or, as the Zoroastrian cosmogony and creation myth state, discerning of genuity from ingenuity. It vindicates once more the genuine state of nature, not to be a prison, but a process. It is the most likely that the origin of the satyr illustration is the leshy. I have explained in the episode in the beginning. Another personification of the lush and fertile earthly domain, often by Christianity associated with the devil. The amount of vilification the satyr has endured is hardly trumped as to this day it is connected to grades of mischief, wickedness, and even evil. Some with little understanding of etymology claim that Satyr and Saturn are related. However, Saturn literally translates to the twisted or twisting of red, and Satyr literally translates to the red of Thor. Judaism forbade sacrifice to the Satyr, as in to nature, which is logical considering its opposition to it. Instead, Judaism was mainly concerned with appeasement of its fallen creator instead through the scapegoat ritual, hoping to avert the solar cataclysm it perceived as targeted punishment. The Satyr, or Karnunas, as a personification of nature, was symbolized as a goat to portray the unimpeded wilds, and it is therefore that the goat was used as the scapegoat since the Hittite Empire era of Judaism's origins, ladening the crimes against nature, yes, on nature. To the Greek, the Satyr was eventually considered an eternal drunk, as is man in nature to the Gnostic, their eventual inspiration. As the personification developed and Gnostic mystery schools gained influence, empowered by their Jewish grandmasters, the depictions and theater plays of the Satyr subject became increasingly grotesque to vilify sexuality comparable to how the porn industry has warped it into violence. The Satyr was promoted as a rapist and debauching delinquent, yes, often depicted childlike. This is again the same old pattern which we see today, with a blemish of pedophilia labeled against the West. Another branch of the Satyr is the figure known as Loki, also being presented as a trickster and brother of Tyr, as in Thor, associated strongly with the taking of many forms, and therefore at its core a personification of the elements, chained to the laws of nature. After all these vilifications of the Satyr, it should come to no surprise that during the Middle Ages the bestiaries of Christianity conflated the European wild man with the Satyr, as today the West is inflicted with the blemish of Satanism as well. Once more I should stress to mean nothing but Red Family, referring to exactly the Western European nature culture peoples. In the mind of a Christian is perceived, however, the imposed illustration of a grotesque, bat-winged, evil creature awaiting in a lake of fire, entirely missing the point of its amalgamate makeup with the same solar relevance as is their supposed savior, Christos. It is the Judaist control over media, which illustrates a warped version of what Satanism truly is, to invoke and channel Christian and Islamic animosity against the nature culture. The imagery portraying Satanism as transsexualism, child molestation, and a blood ritual is a classic example of loading the misdeeds of oneself onto its target again. It is Judaism that employs transsexualism, child molestation, and blood rituals, not the Satanists. The Satanists procreates. That is why the Satanist is called a human sacrificer, sacrificing to the jealous demiurge, according to Judaism. Even the likes of Aleister Crowley were but performance of Judaism, not Satanism, even in their inversions of so-called biblical tenets, because the inversion of biblical tenets is simply the inversion of the law of nature. It is only presented under pretense of requirements. The Satanist is exactly that which is portrayed as what Christianity should be, a homesteader, except for the detail that the Satanist is also a self-reliant, one could say, anarchist, nature dweller, self-sufficient and in balance with their surroundings. Closest to a Satanist comes the Amish. No wonder, as Christianity was, after all, initially merely an appropriation of the pagan lifestyle. Albeit the Amish too are entirely brainwashed into the Abrahamic paradigm, nevertheless. The pagan homesteader, as in self-reliant, was already vilified, remember, as savages, the herbalist as a witch. The differentiator would be that the Satanist gives no fealty to priests and princes, neither to Jewish forms of God, and especially not to a made-up idol called Jesus, nor mercenary called Muhammad. Nature gives consequence without requiring counsel. This does not work for a hierarchy, for a priest class. The vilification of the nature culture, whether or no through strawmen, has to end. Whether it is portraying the Creator as an entrapper and destroyer, on the left example, or vilifying the aspects of nature, on the right example, so too the appropriation and vilification of the solar symbology has to end and be returned to its rightful people. Do understand that even the illustration of Christ on the cross refers directly to the fall and resurrection of the Son. The skull of Adam Katman at its base verifies it. The cross, even though the symbol of the crossing lines is but the solar wheel of seasons, as a word means pole, and does not refer to these crossing lines which allegorically mark the spot. No, it is the leafless, branchless tree, the magnetic mount, or wooden hill on, or rather from, which the Son was sacrificed, and after 3 days rose again. Deprogramming the Christian and the Muslim may be tedious, and often fruitless. However, you may have learned that of their creator, the Judaist, there is a faction much more likely to be reintegrated into its origins, the pagan nature culture. The Christian and Muslim resists this, which is their purpose, calls this Jew Luciferian and Satanic, words completely misunderstood. But it is these Jews that are the most genuine and righteous. It is these Jews that are called fake Jews. Now, there were claims that during the Second World War, Karaite Jews were left alone in Poland because they were not real Jews and merely converted Khazarians. But I think I have here proven their genuity beyond doubt. Still, it will indeed be this Karaite Khazarian Jew that will be the first to be deprogrammed from the destructive religion of Judaism. And this is why this Khazarian Jew is so hated and targeted by his old masters. The ex-Jew is despised over the Goyim. Considered merely an animal, he is the diluted Jew, the traitor. Now, the conclusion of the stay-at-home Karaites witnessing the northbound branch would be that they, as the mourners of Zion, as they titled themselves, could initially not stomach the reality that the aforementioned branch, as Mojor and beyond, had their Judaist anti-nature purpose diluted. The interwarring has continued ever since, but those who study the Torah so piously are the only ones that can come to understand its deceptions. But this is why there is such a Q movement set up online right now to blemish such apostates into the scapegoat associated with the deep state, which is code for nature as created from the abyssal waters. Or did anyone here think that there actually was a satanic pedophile elite? For fuck's sake, at best there is a deranged addict class prepped up to look like an elite, paid as much as blackmailed through the Epstein Mossad child prostitute rings. None of them are Jews, fake or real. Very well. Let the Karaite apostates be scapegoated and called a fake Jew as they return to the nature culture, if that is what it takes. Let them be called satanic, one of us, the Red Family. Let them be called devil worshippers, worshipping the true creator, the Son. Now, cast off the spells of Judaism and help me rectify it before it rectifies the intended process of our cycle. I conclude my work, hoping that this will finally find traction and spread by your joint effort. What more can I do, other than what I have manifested here? The full translation of our genuine history, expunging the fraud and ongoing Babylonian speech confusion from at least the minds that have beheld this yet. May the sun shine on you, prosperity to your endeavor.
Just a man tipping on a wire, tightrope walking fool, balanced on desire. I cannot control these ever-changing ways, so how can I be sure will remain? It'll always change, but everything I am is yours. Everything I am what's going on inside. Got these little walls, I couldn't break them if I tried. But I promise I'll be true, and I promise I'll be right. Sickness and in health, in the darkness and the light, I give you every side. 'Cause everything I am is yours. Everything I am